Jeanne d'Arc directly threatened the existence of the English army on the battlefields of France. The English faction bought her from an allied group to eliminate this commander. They denied prisoner rights and handed her to a group of lackey clergy for conviction. Exploiting the strict laws against male clothing to secure a heresy conviction provided the English with the legal pretext to burn her alive. Guards tied her to the wooden stake and handed her to the executioner to conduct the fire-lighting process. The executioner burned her body and smashed the bones after lighting the fire 3 times. A group of soldiers threw the ashes into the Seine River to extinguish all symbols of the opposition faction. Those ashes drifting down the currents were meant to permanently extinguish the Armagnac will to fight. Yet, the catastrophic political collapse that made her execution a geopolitical necessity had been engineered decades earlier. Joan of Arc emerged during a period of deep crisis for France in the early 15th century. The ongoing Hundred Years' War had already devastated the countryside and ruined the local economy. However, the English invasion was only part of the nation's struggle. The country was also facing a catastrophic breakdown within its own monarchy. The French sovereign, King Charles VI, suffered from a severe and incapacitating mental illness. His condition started in 1392 with a violent breakdown. It grew progressively worse over the years. He eventually developed a highly localized delusion where he believed his body was made of fragile glass. Terrified of shattering, he had iron rods sewn into his clothes. He also banned anyone from touching him. Because the king could no longer rule, the central authority of the French government collapsed. Ambitious nobles stepped into this power vacuum. They fought fiercely for control over the weakened nation. This struggle triggered a brutal civil war between 2 heavily armed political factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. This deep internal division ultimately paved the way for further English conquests. The Armagnac faction eventually aligned itself with the king's sole surviving legitimate heir, the Dauphin Charles VII. Opposing them were the Burgundians, commanded by the immensely wealthy and militarily powerful Duke of Burgundy, John the Fearless. The Burgundian objective was not merely to influence the incapacitated king. They intended to monopolize the French treasury and the state apparatus. The political friction rapidly escalated into targeted high-level assassinations. In 1407, operatives acting on the direct orders of John the Fearless ambushed the king's brother, Louis, Duke of Orléans. They killed him in the dark streets of Paris. This assassination shattered any remaining pretense of aristocratic diplomacy. The Armagnacs sought uncompromising retaliation. They engaged in a decade of bitter proxy warfare and urban combat against the Burgundian forces. The feud reached its definitive climax in 1419. Attempting to negotiate a tenuous peace treaty to unify France against the invading English, the Dauphin Charles VII and John the Fearless agreed to meet on the bridge at Montereau. It was a planned ambush. As the Duke of Burgundy knelt before the Dauphin, Armagnac operatives drew their weapons. They assassinated John the Fearless, splitting his skull with an axe. This political violence permanently severed the French state. The new Duke of Burgundy, Philip the Good, abandoned the French cause. He formally forged a military alliance with the English crown, vowing to annihilate the Armagnac faction and the Dauphin. Exploiting this internal division, the English King Henry V launched an invasion of the continent. In 1415, the English forces engaged the French nobility at the Battle of Agincourt. The engagement was a tactical disaster for the French. Utilizing the technological superiority of the English longbow and exploiting the muddy, compressed terrain, Henry V systematically eliminated the core of the French military elite. Thousands of French knights, weighed down by heavy plate armor, fell in the mud. This event decapitated the military leadership of the Armagnac faction. By 1420, the combined military pressure of the English army and their Burgundian allies forced the fractured French government to total capitulation. Queen Isabeau of Bavaria, acting on behalf of her incapacitated husband, Charles VI, signed the Treaty of Troyes. This document was a highly effective piece of legal and geopolitical engineering. It formally disinherited the Dauphin Charles VII, legally branding him as illegitimate and stripping him of his right to the French throne. Furthermore, the treaty forced the marriage of the French Princess Catherine of Valois directly to the English King Henry V. The legal architecture of the treaty mandated that upon the death of Charles VI, the crown of France would pass legally to the English royal family. When both King Henry V and King Charles VI died within months of each other in 1422, the infant English King Henry VI was proclaimed King of France. The Dauphin Charles VII was bankrupt, politically isolated, and militarily broken. He was driven out of Paris and the Northern Territories. He established a shadow government south of the Loire River, where he was mockingly referred to by the English and Burgundians as the Little King of Bourges. The English military forces and their Burgundian allies possessed unchallenged control over Paris, Normandy, and the critical northern supply routes. Functionally, legally, and militarily, the independent nation of France had ceased to exist. It was against this grim backdrop of national ruin that Jeanne was born around 1412 in the village of Domremy. The historical narrative frequently deployed in subsequent centuries paints her as a dirt-poor, romanticized, and uneducated shepherdess. This specific myth was largely fabricated years later to emphasize the miraculous, divine nature of her ascension. It constructed a narrative wherein God chose the lowest member of society to humble the powerful. The forensic historical reality extracted from contemporary tax records and municipal documents presents a vastly different socioeconomic picture. The D'Arc family was not destitute. They were firmly established as the rural elite of Domremy. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, was a prominent and deeply involved municipal official. He owned approximately 50 acres of land, a substantial holding for a rural family in the 15th century. Furthermore, he served as a dayan. He was a local tax collector and primary administrative representative for the village, reporting directly to the regional authorities. Jacques d'Arc also commanded the local municipal militia. He was responsible for organizing the defense of Domremy against the frequent raids conducted by English and Burgundian mercenary companies. Demonstrating significant financial and administrative capability, Jacques d'Arc and other village leaders successfully negotiated the lease of a local fortified structure, the Château de Lille. They utilized it as a secure defensive fallback position for the community's livestock and citizens during military incursions. Jeanne's mother, Isabelle Romée, possessed sufficient resources to undertake religious pilgrimages and provided her daughter with a rigorous Orthodox Catholic education. Jeanne did not emerge from abject poverty. She was raised in a structured, politically aware household that was intimately familiar with the realities of border warfare and regional administration. Beyond her socioeconomic status, her early adolescence was defined by a fierce independence that shocked local authorities. In the year 1428, prior to her arrival at the royal court, a young man from the neighboring town of Toul formally sued Jeanne in an ecclesiastical court. He alleged that she had committed a breach of contract by refusing to fulfill a binding promise of marriage. Jeanne traveled to the court in Toul and firmly rejected the legal representation of her parents. She successfully defended herself entirely alone. She aggressively argued the case before the ecclesiastical judges and won the dismissal of the suit. Operating under 15th century canon law, which established the legal age of consent for women at 12, her solo defense was technically permissible but socially extraordinary for a rural teenager. This specific legal victory demonstrates a profound intellectual capability and a total refusal to yield to patriarchal control. Rather than being a passive, uneducated peasant waiting for divine instruction, she was already a formidable, articulate advocate. She was capable of dismantling legal arguments in a formal ecclesiastical tribunal long before she ever commanded an army. Regardless of her exact biological age, the fundamental trajectory of Jeanne La Pucelle's life was irreversibly altered during her adolescence by the onset of specific auditory and visual phenomena. According to her own trial transcripts, while standing in her father's garden at the age of 13, she was struck by a blinding illumination. She began receiving direct verbal communications from entities she identified as originating from heaven. Initially vague, these phenomena eventually stabilized into three recognizable figures: the Archangel Michael, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, and Saint Margaret of Antioch. The selection of these specific entities is highly significant in the context of medieval theology. Both Saint Catherine and Saint Margaret were venerated as virgin martyrs. They were women who had suffered publicized physical tortures for their refusal to compromise their faith and their physical purity. To these specific saints, Jeanne swore a legally and spiritually binding vow of perpetual virginity. This vow was not merely an act of religious devotion. It was the foundational requirement for her subsequent political legitimacy. In the 15th century theological framework, absolute physical virginity was widely considered the only impenetrable shield against demonic possession. Joan of Arc did not receive vague spiritual advice. Her visions delivered a precise military and political strategy encompassing several integrated directives. The immediate operational goal involved lifting the English siege of Orléans. Successfully breaking the siege would open the route to safely escort Charles VII to Reims for his official coronation as king. Following the coronation, the campaign aimed to recapture Paris from enemy forces and ultimately secure the release of the Duke of Orléans from captivity in London. To execute these monumental geopolitical objectives, Jeanne required access to the absolute highest echelons of the French military and political command. A peasant girl from a border village possessed zero intrinsic authority to demand an audience with the Dauphin. To bypass this rigid social hierarchy, Jeanne leveraged one of the most powerful psychological weapons available in the medieval era: popular prophecy. The French populace, devastated by decades of warfare, famine, and political betrayal, was entirely desperate for a savior. To cope with the trauma, rumors, and ancient prophecies heavily circulated throughout the kingdom. The most prominent was a prophecy attributed to the ancient figure of Merlin. It stated that the realm of France would be completely ruined by a woman, but would ultimately be saved by a virgin originating from the borders of Lorraine. Another contemporary rumor attributed to the visionary Marie Robin of Avignon echoed this exact sentiment. The ruinous woman was universally understood by the French public to be Queen Isabeau of Bavaria. She was the woman who had signed the disastrous Treaty of Troyes and legally handed the French crown to the English. Jeanne La Pucelle did not attempt to hide from these prophecies. She actively absorbed them. She publicly and confidently declared to anyone who would listen that she was the prophesied virgin from the Lorraine border destined to save the state. She weaponized the existing cultural psychology of France. This forced the local authorities to either acknowledge her potential divine mandate or risk defying a widely accepted national prophecy. The first operational hurdle was securing a heavily armed military escort to transport her across 400 miles of hostile, Burgundian-controlled territory to the Dauphin's court at Chinon. To achieve this, Jeanne approached Robert de Baudricourt, the hardened military commander of the neighboring garrison town of Vaucouleurs. In May 1428, she presented herself to Baudricourt, demanding an armed escort. Following the rigid dictates of standard military logic, Baudricourt laughed in her face and dismissed her claims. He explicitly ordered her cousin to drag her back to Domremy and physically beat her for her insolence. However, Jeanne was unyielding. She returned to Vaucouleurs in January 1429. Recognizing that theological claims were insufficient to move a seasoned military commander, she executed a precise tactical maneuver. She provided Baudricourt with a startling, classified military prediction. She informed the commander that the French army, operating hundreds of miles away, was currently suffering a humiliating defeat near the city of Orléans in an engagement that would become known as the Battle of the Herrings. Days later, a bloodied military messenger arrived at Vaucouleurs. He formally confirmed the disaster exactly as Jeanne had described it, down to the timeline and the strategic failures. Shaken by this impossible intelligence and heavily pressured by two of his own veteran knights, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, who had become entirely convinced of her divine mandate, Baudricourt's resistance collapsed. He capitulated, providing her with a horse, a sword, and a specialized escort of 6 men-at-arms for the extraction to Chinon. Before she departed for the royal court, Jeanne's political trajectory intersected with the supreme strategist of the Armagnac faction, Yolande of Aragon. Yolande was the incredibly wealthy, intelligent, and ruthless mother-in-law of Dauphin Charles VII, controlling a vast, decentralized intelligence network. She was desperately searching for a unifying figurehead. She needed a psychological weapon capable of rallying the deeply fractured, demoralized French military against the English. Mainstream forensic history rejects the theories that Jeanne was a covertly trained operative. Instead, the reality is far more compelling. Yolande recognized the raw, unpolished power of Jeanne's uncompromising conviction and strategically chose to weaponize it. She threw her political and financial weight behind the teenager, providing the necessary armor, logistical support, and ideological backing to legitimize her at court. Jeanne's subsequent displays of martial capability were not the result of secret training camps. They were the rapid adaptation of an exceptionally intelligent individual driven by religious zeal. She absorbed military tactics on the march, converting her spiritual certainty into a blunt force operational doctrine that veteran commanders could neither predict nor defend against. Jeanne had to survive a dangerous 11-day journey across enemy territory to reach the royal court at Chinon. To do this, she completely changed her appearance. She cut her hair short like a soldier and wore standard men's clothing. This was a practical choice to hide her true identity. It also served as a necessary defense to protect her from severe physical harm by roaming groups of mercenaries. Upon her arrival at the heavily fortified Château de Chinon in late February 1429, Dauphin Charles VII remained deeply suspicious. He was surrounded by cynical advisors who warned him that the girl was likely an English spy, a lunatic, or a demonic operative sent to initiate his final political destruction. To test her supposed divine sight, Charles orchestrated an elaborate deception. He stripped off his royal garments, dressed himself in the plain clothes of a minor courtier, and hid himself deep within a crowded hall filled with over 300 members of the high nobility. Jeanne was escorted into the great hall. Demonstrating zero hesitation, she bypassed the decoy posing as the Dauphin, walked directly through the dense crowd of aristocrats, and knelt precisely before Charles. According to contemporary chronicles, she leaned forward and whispered a classified secret directly into his ear. This was a secret that supposedly only he and God knew, convincing the Dauphin of her legitimacy. While the exact nature of this secret remains lost to history, it secured her the immediate attention of the French crown. Despite the successful identification at Chinon, Charles VII could not immediately hand command of the remaining French military forces to an unknown teenager based on a parlor trick. The geopolitical stakes were absolute. If he utilized her in battle, and she was subsequently proven to be a witch or a heretic, the English propaganda machine would immediately broadcast to all of Europe that the Dauphin of France derived his power directly from Satan. This would permanently destroy any remaining legal or theological claim he had to the throne. To ensure strict ideological security, Charles dispatched Jeanne to the city of Poitiers. There, she was subjected to 3 weeks of relentless theological interrogation. The tribunal was comprised of France's top theologians, bishops, and university scholars who had remained loyal to the Armagnac cause. The tribunal attempted to trap her with complex theological paradoxes, testing her orthodoxy, her sanity, and the specific nature of her auditory hallucinations. Concurrently, Yolande of Aragon personally oversaw an invasive physical medical examination conducted by a panel of trusted noblewomen. The objective of this examination was to strictly verify Jeanne's physical virginity. In the legal and theological framework of 1429, physical intactness was the ultimate forensic proof against demonic corruption. It was widely believed that witches engaged in physical intercourse with incubi to secure their powers. After 3 weeks of intense scrutiny, the Tribunal of Poitiers issued their official verdict. They concluded that Jeanne Le Pucelle was pure, devout, perfectly sane, and free of any demonic influence. The Church granted her definitive theological legitimacy, explicitly authorizing Charles VII to deploy her against the English forces at Orléans. With her ideological clearance secured, the French state mobilized its resources to transition the teenager into a military commander. She was fitted with a suit of expensive, custom-forged white plate armor. She refused a standard-issue weapon, instead directing the clergy to unearth an ancient, rust-covered sword buried behind the altar of the Church of Sainte Catherine de Fierbois. She claimed her voices had revealed this weapon to her. Finally, she was provided with her most vital instrument of command, an imposing, visible battle standard constructed of white linen, embroidered with the golden lilies of France and the words Jesus Maria. She was no longer a peasant visionary. She was now the fully armed, state-sanctioned wrath of the French monarchy, and she immediately turned her sights on the battleground of Orléans. Prior to the spring of 1429, the operational military doctrine of the French army was defined by paralyzing caution and defensive posturing. The devastation inflicted by the English longbowmen at Agincourt had fundamentally traumatized the French command structure. French generals actively avoided direct, open-field engagements, allowing the English to systematically lay siege to critical infrastructure. The city of Orléans was the final strategic choke point preventing the English from sweeping across the Loire River and entirely conquering the southern remnants of France. It had been under a suffocating siege for 6 months. The French defenders were starving, deeply demoralized, and mathematically projected to fall. When Jeanne Le Pucelle arrived at Orléans in late April 1429, accompanied by a French relief army and supply convoys, she immediately dismantled the existing tactical paradigm. She possessed no formal military education. Ironically, this freed her from the ingrained, paralyzing fear of the English longbow. She scrapped the defensive, attrition-based strategies of the veteran French commanders, including the bastard of Orléans, Jean de Dunois. In their place, she initiated a military campaign of rapid, aggressive frontal assaults directly against the heavily fortified English positions. The shockwave of her command style was immediate. On May 4, bypassing the cautious planning of her generals, she led a sudden, violent charge against the Bastille of Saint-Lô, an English stronghold east of the city. The assault was a resounding success. The French forces wiped out the entire English garrison, shattering a critical link in the siege ring and securing a crucial psychological victory. 2 days later, on May 6, she directed the French military against the complex of Les Augustins. During the initial assault, the French troops encountered heavy resistance. They panicked and initiated a chaotic, disorganized route back toward the river. Operating with visible courage, Jeanne refused to retreat. Completely alone, she planted her massive white standard in the mud and charged directly back into the teeth of the English lines. Witnessing a teenage girl rush unarmored into a wall of English steel, the retreating French infantry halted. Driven by a combination of religious zeal and profound shame, the French forces rallied. They executed a massive countercharge that overwhelmed the fortifications and defeated the defenders. The siege culminated on May 7 with the assault on Les Tourelles. This was the massive, heavily fortified gatehouse controlling the primary bridge into Orléans. The fighting was exceptionally brutal, characterized by close-quarters melee and heavy artillery fire. During the height of the assault, as Jeanne was physically climbing a wooden scaling ladder placed against the stone walls, she sustained a catastrophic, potentially lethal injury. A heavy English crossbow bolt, designed to pierce plate armor, struck her directly. It slammed deeply into the space between her neck and shoulder. Under standard medieval combat conditions, this exact category of trauma dictated immediate removal from the battlefield and months of localized recovery, assuming the victim survived the subsequent infection. Jeanne was pulled from the fighting. The iron arrow was ripped from her flesh, and the open wound was hastily packed with a mixture of raw lard and olive oil to stall the hemorrhaging. Defying severe blood loss and physical shock, she refused to be evacuated. She grabbed her battle standard and ran straight back to the front line of the assault. The visual impact of this return was devastating to the enemy. The English defenders, who had seen her take a lethal strike and fall, watched her return from the dead. Their psychological resolve fractured. William Glasdale, the English garrison commander who had previously shouted degrading insults at her from the parapets, drowned in the river when the wooden bridge collapsed under the weight of his panicking, retreating, armor-clad men. By the dawn of the following morning, the remaining English army abandoned their siege equipment and initiated a full, disorganized retreat. In a matter of days, the teenage commander had broken a siege that veteran generals had deemed unwinnable. Orléans was saved. Jean Le Pucelle refused to allow the French military machine to stall or consolidate its gains. Recognizing that the English forces were psychologically broken, she demanded the immediate launch of a rapid, mobile offensive known as the Loire Campaign. Throughout June 1429, she swept through the remaining English strongholds along the river valley with terrifying speed. At the siege of Jargeau, her physical endurance was tested again. While scaling a fortification wall, she was struck directly on the helmet by a heavy stone cannonball. The kinetic impact knocked her off the ladder, throwing her to the ground. She immediately sprang back to her feet, unfazed, demanding her artillery and infantry to advance. This relentless momentum culminated on June 18, 1429, at the Battle of Patay. This engagement was the lethal mirror image of the disaster at Agincourt. The veteran English commanders, John Fastolf and John Talbot, were actively preparing their standard defensive positions. They were hammering heavy, sharpened wooden stakes into the ground, designed to impale and shred the French heavy cavalry. The tactical setup was compromised by an environmental accident. A lone, panicked stag ran out of the surrounding woods and sprinted directly through the concealed English lines. The English soldiers, operating on hunting instincts and lacking strict operational discipline, instinctively yelled and attempted to chase the deer. This acoustic disturbance gave away their hidden, vulnerable position to the advancing French scouts. Driven entirely by Jeanne's strategic doctrine of aggression, the French vanguard, led by the capable commander La Hire, did not hesitate or wait for the infantry to form up. They launched an immediate, lightning-fast, heavy cavalry strike. The French knights slammed into the English archers before the longbowmen could finish setting their defensive stakes or string their weapons. The engagement devolved into a rout. Over 2,000 highly trained English soldiers were killed in a matter of minutes. The English command structure was dismantled. John Talbot was physically captured on the field, and John Fastolf was forced to flee for his life. The long-standing, paralyzing myth of English military invincibility was permanently buried in the mud at Patay. Jeanne was not merely a frontline tactician. She possessed an acute understanding of psychological warfare. She utilized the English fear of the supernatural to degrade their operational capabilities. She dictated aggressive, threatening letters directed to the English regent, the Duke of Bedford. She explicitly demanded the immediate surrender of the keys to every major city in France. The English rank-and-file troops were demoralized. Mutinies and mass desertions skyrocketed across the English garrisons. This was driven by the terror that they were fighting a demonic sorceress who could resurrect herself from lethal wounds and command the weather. The English High Command, writing panicked, classified dispatches back to the Royal Treasury in London, explicitly admitted that their army was paralyzed by the fear of a disciple and limb of the fiend. Exploiting this strategic vacuum, Jeanne executed her primary geopolitical objective. She bypassed Paris and drove the French army deep into hostile, Burgundian-controlled territory. On July 17, 1429, just months after she had assumed military command, Dauphin Charles VII walked into the Cathedral of Reims and was officially crowned King of France. Jeanne stood directly beside the altar, wearing her armor and holding her battle standard. By successfully ensuring that Charles received the Holy Chrism in the traditional, undisputed seat of French kings, she dismantled the legal and theological foundation of the English claim to the throne established by the Treaty of Troyes. Charles VII was now the undisputed, legitimate sovereign of the French state. The coronation at Reims marked the apex of Jeanne's military and political glory. However, the immediate aftermath of the ceremony triggered a severe, ultimately fatal strategic fracture between the commander and her king. Following his coronation, King Charles VII abandoned the doctrine of aggression. He wanted to stall the military advance, consolidate his power, and initiate complex, protracted diplomatic negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy, attempting to sever the Burgundian alliance with the English. Jeanne vehemently opposed this geopolitical pivot. She recognized that the English and Burgundian forces were disorganized and reeling. She demanded an immediate, unyielding military strike against the capital city of Paris to decapitate the occupation government before they could reinforce their garrisons. Forced to yield to her immense popularity among the infantry, the king reluctantly authorized the attack. On September 8, 1429, Jeanne led a direct frontal assault on the formidable, heavily fortified walls of Paris. The operation was a logistical and tactical disaster. The Parisian garrison was heavily reinforced and waiting. The French artillery failed to breach the walls. During the brutal fighting in the muddy trenches, Jeanne was shot at close range by a crossbow bolt. The iron projectile passed entirely through her thigh. Her standard fell into the mud. Despite her agonizing demands to continue the assault, the king's commanders physically dragged her from the field. Charles VII explicitly ordered a total, immediate military retreat to quietly neutralize her political influence and push her out of the active military command structure. The king executed a cynical bureaucratic maneuver. He formally elevated her entire family to the high nobility, granting them the aristocratic surname du Lys. He also permanently exempted her home village of Domremy from all royal taxation. It was essentially a decorated, heavily compensated, honorable discharge. The French crown had utilized her to secure legitimacy and now wished to discard the weapon before it disrupted their diplomatic strategies. However, driven by ideological conviction and the continuous directives of her voices, Jeanne la Pucelle firmly refused to stop fighting. Following the catastrophic failure at Paris and the calculated bureaucratic dismissal orchestrated by King Charles VII, Jeanne la Pucelle was officially stripped of her royal military backing. Functioning essentially as an independent warlord, she cobbled together a small mercenary force. She continued to engage Burgundian units across the northern territories throughout the spring of 1430. In May 1430, Jeanne mobilized her forces to defend the strategic town of Compiègne. It was under heavy siege by an overwhelming Burgundian army commanded by Philip the Good. On the evening of May 23, she executed an aggressive sortie, She led a rapid cavalry strike intended to overrun an isolated Burgundian encampment. The initial assault was successful, but the Burgundians rapidly reinforced the position, deploying overwhelming numbers. Recognizing the tactical disadvantage, Jeanne ordered a fighting retreat back toward the fortified gates of Compiègne. Commanding the rear guard, she positioned herself at the rear of the retreating column, utilizing her heavy cavalry to shield the fleeing infantry. As the remaining French forces funneled onto the bridge leading to the city, a logistical failure occurred. The French military commander operating inside Compiègne, Guillaume de Flavy, issued a direct order to permanently close the massive iron portcullis and raise the wooden drawbridge. Historical consensus remains divided on the exact motivation behind this command. It was either an act of sheer panic by a commander terrified that the pursuing Burgundian heavy infantry would breach the gates, or it was a deliberate act of political betrayal engineered to eliminate a rogue commander who was disrupting the crown's diplomatic negotiations. Regardless of the motive, the physical result was absolute. Jeanne and her immediate rearguard were trapped against the impassable stone walls of the city, cut off from all reinforcement. Surrounded and overwhelmed by enemy infantry, Jeanne was violently pulled from her warhorse by a Burgundian archer and officially taken prisoner. The capture of the Maid of Orléans was a monumental strategic turning point. She was transferred to the custody of Jean de Luxembourg, a high-ranking Burgundian commander, and transported to the heavily fortified tower of the Château de Beaudrevois. Jeanne was not a passive, compliant captive. She maintained a functioning intelligence network even while incarcerated. She rapidly became aware of covert negotiations, indicating that she was to be permanently sold directly to the English government. Recognizing that transfer to English guaranteed her execution, she resorted to an act of astonishing physical desperation. She managed to bypass her immediate guards and threw her own body from the high window of the Beaurevoir Tower. She plummeted approximately 70 feet into the dry, hard-packed earth of the fortress moat. Under standard biological parameters, a fall from this altitude is lethal or guarantees massive, paralyzing spinal and cranial trauma. Miraculously, Jeanne sustained 0 broken bones. The kinetic impact knocked her violently unconscious, and she was immediately recaptured by the panicked garrison, but her anatomical structure remained intact. Under the binding medieval rules of warfare and chivalry, a sovereign king was morally and legally obligated to immediately ransom his captured generals and high-ranking nobility. King Charles VII, the specific monarch who occupied the throne of France entirely because of Jeanne's military victories and the blood of her infantry, possessed the financial capability to secure her release. He did nothing. Charles VII maintained a stony, calculated silence. He did not dispatch a single diplomatic envoy. He did not offer a single coin to the Burgundians. Terrified that openly defending a woman actively being accused of witchcraft by the English would retroactively invalidate his coronation and taint his crown, Charles permanently abandoned his primary military asset to the enemy. Exploiting this diplomatic vacuum, the English government aggressively intervened. Leveraging the diplomatic mediation of Bishop Pierre Cauchon, the English crown negotiated the purchase of the prisoner. The agreed ransom was 10,000 livres tournois, a staggering sum of capital equivalent to the ransom of a sovereign king. To generate this immense liquidity, the English administrative apparatus squeezed the civilian population of occupied Normandy, levying punitive emergency taxes. The transaction was finalized. By December 1430, Jean Le Pucelle was securely locked in a military dungeon in Rouen, the heavily fortified administrative capital of the English occupation in France. The English High Command faced an unprecedented, complex legal dilemma. They could not simply execute Jeanne under standard secular or military law. Decapitating or hanging her as an enemy combatant would immediately validate her status as a legitimate prisoner of war. This would permanently elevate her to the status of a French national martyr. The English required undeniable ideological destruction. They needed the highest authority of the Catholic Church to formally condemn her. If an Inquisition tribunal successfully found her guilty of witchcraft, heresy, and demonic association, the English propaganda machine would achieve its ultimate strategic objective. Her military victories would be legally and theologically attributed to the intervention of Satan, and by direct extension, the coronation of King Charles VII would be branded as the illegal work of the devil, permanently destroying the legitimacy of the French state. The resulting trial at Rouen was a highly calculated political tribunal, micromanaged and directly funded by the English royal treasury. The trial possessed zero legal independence. A classified internal royal document drafted by the English command explicitly stated that if the ecclesiastical court somehow failed to secure a conviction, the church was required to hand the prisoner directly back to the English military, where she would be executed regardless of the verdict. The outcome of the tribunal was rigged from its inception. The presiding judge was Bishop Pierre Cauchon. Cauchon was an ambitious, embittered French cleric who was fiercely loyal to the English and the Burgundian faction. He possessed a personal vendetta against Jeanne, as her military campaigns had directly resulted in him being forcibly driven out of his own lucrative diocese of Beauvais by Armagnac forces. Cauchon staffed the tribunal with over 70 educated theologians, legal scholars, and clerics. He sourced them primarily from the fiercely pro-English University of Paris. The tribunal represented the apex of European intellectual capability, assembled specifically to dismantle the psychology of a single, illiterate teenager. To secure the predetermined conviction, Cauchon and the tribunal systematically violated nearly every foundational procedural rule of medieval canon law. An Inquisition trial for heresy legally required the establishment of a diffamatio, preliminary, documented evidence of a suspect's evil reputation or heretical actions prior to the opening of the trial. Cauchon dispatched a trusted ecclesiastical investigator directly to Jeanne's home village of Domremy to gather this required intelligence. When the investigator returned and formally reported that Jeanne possessed a flawless reputation as a pious, orthodox, and model Catholic, Cauchon immediately suppressed the evidence. He buried the official report and physically expelled the investigator from the court proceedings. Furthermore, in direct violation of inquisitorial procedure, Jeanne was denied legal counsel or representation. The trial procedure contained a critical legal breach regarding her imprisonment conditions. Church regulations explicitly required female defendants facing religious charges to be detained solely in ecclesiastical facilities managed by church authorities, under the supervision of female guards. The presiding judge entirely disregarded this mandate by confining her within a secular military fortress controlled by English forces. Instead of church oversight, she faced continuous surveillance by a squad of hostile soldiers hostile to her past military actions. This environment exposed her to severe psychological pressure, intimidation, and constant danger. Additionally, security protocols required heavy iron fetters, chaining her ankles securely to a massive wooden log attached directly to her bed to prevent escape. Despite the severe physical degradation, sleep deprivation, and the constant threat of violence, Jeanne did not psychologically collapse. Functionally illiterate, she entered the courtroom and mentally dueled with the greatest theological minds in Europe. She demonstrated an astonishing capability to detect and bypass complex intellectual traps. The tribunal systematically attempted to trap her within rigid theological paradoxes designed to force her into committing verbal heresy on the official court record. The most lethal of these interrogations occurred on February 24, 1431. A leading theologian on the panel presented her with a calculated, seemingly impossible question. Do you know if you are in the grace of God? This was a brilliantly engineered intellectual snare. According to the uncompromising church doctrine of the 15th century, no mortal human being possessed the theological capability to know with absolute certainty if they were currently in a state of divine grace. If Jeanne answered yes, she was committing the severe sin of supreme theological arrogance. This would directly contradict church dogma and prove herself a heretic. If she answered no, she was explicitly admitting on the official record that she was spiritually compromised, effectively confessing that her voices and her military victories were driven by demonic influence. Jeanne stared directly at the panel of heavily educated scholars and delivered a flawlessly calibrated response. If I am not, may God put me there. And if I am, may God so keep me. I should be the saddest creature in the world if I knew I were not in His grace. The official court clerk, recording the proceedings in real time, noted in the margins of the transcript that the judges were stunned into total silence. A teenage girl, lacking any formal theological education, had effortlessly bypassed a trap designed by university masters. She answered with such profound, unassailable orthodoxy that they were forced to immediately suspend that line of questioning. By April 1431, the combination of extreme physical confinement, stress, and the highly unsanitary conditions of the military dungeon caused Jeanne's biological systems to severely deteriorate. She fell violently ill, suffering from acute gastrointestinal distress after consuming a piece of carp provided directly by Bishop Cochon. The severe illness triggered panic within the highest echelons of the English High Command. The Earl of Warwick, the supreme English military commander in Rouen, ordered his personal physicians to intervene and save her life at all costs. Warwick explicitly instructed the medical personnel, "The king has bought her dear and does not want her to die a natural death. She must be burned publicly." Frustrated by Jeanne's unyielding psychological endurance and her refusal to contradict her initial testimony, Cochon escalated the pressure. He marched her directly into the subterranean torture chambers of the fortress. He presented her to the state executioners and forced her to visually inspect the mechanical instruments of torture. He explicitly threatened to have her joints violently dislocated on the rack if she did not confess that her voices were demonic. Operating with cold defiance, Jeanne informed the bishop that even if they physically tore her limbs from her torso, she would not change a single word of her story. She stated that if the agony forced her to say something different, she would immediately retract it the moment the torture stopped. Recognizing that a confession extracted through visible physical violence would completely ruin the strictly legal facade of their highly expensive show trial, the council voted against applying the physical mechanics of torture. They required her to break psychologically, not mechanically. Unable to defeat her theology and legally barred from utilizing the rack, the tribunal executed a cynical pivot to a strict, literal legal technicality. They focused the entire weight of the prosecution on her physical clothing. Citing the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, which strictly forbids women from wearing the garments of men, the court formally accused her of defying the natural, divine order and committing heresy through transvestitism. They repeatedly ordered her to abandon her male military clothing and put on a traditional female dress. The modern historical narrative often misinterprets her refusal as an early statement of gender identity or sheer, stubborn defiance against authority. The forensic reality of her imprisonment dictates an entirely different logic. Her refusal to wear a dress had absolutely nothing to do with gender politics. It was a strict matter of immediate physical survival. Medieval male military clothing, particularly the garments worn underneath plate armor, was highly specialized. It consisted of a heavy canvas tunic and thick trousers, which were physically locked together by a complex interconnected system of up to 20 tightly knotted cords known as aiguillettes. Jeanne was chained in a dark cell and closely guarded by armed men who constantly threatened her safety. Her tightly tied clothing served as her only physical defense against their aggression. The complex, tightly knotted cords made it extremely difficult for anyone to remove her garments by force while she actively resisted. Bishop Cochon and the judges fully understood this situation. By ordering her to wear loose, unfastened clothing, they were not simply enforcing religious rules. They were deliberately removing her physical protection and using the constant threat of harm to break her spirit as the trial reached its final stage. On May 24, 1431, the ecclesiastical tribunal executed a calculated psychological operation. Jeanne was dragged to the cemetery of Seine, positioned directly in front of the executioner, and explicitly threatened with immediate death by fire. Exhausted, terrified, and physically degraded by months of imprisonment, she capitulated. She agreed to sign a brief, 6-line document pledging to abandon her male military garments and let her hair grow. However, the court engaged in a blatant legal fraud. The official court records were subsequently swapped with a 500-word Latin forgery wherein Jeanne supposedly confessed that her voices were demonic fabrications. Upon signing the original document, Jeanne requested an immediate transfer to a church-administered prison guarded by women, as dictated by canon law. Bishop Cochon sneered and commanded the English guards to return her directly to the secular, military dungeon. 3 days later, the trap snapped shut. The tribunal was informed that Jeanne had resumed wearing male clothing. Decades later, a formal rehabilitation trial uncovered the forensic reality of that cell. Witness testimony revealed that a high-ranking English lord had infiltrated her cell at night, brutally beaten her, and attempted to assault her. Fighting him off, she recognized that she had to resume wearing the heavily laced military garments to survive. Furthermore, on Sunday morning, the guards explicitly stole her dress, threw it into a sack, and tossed her the forbidden male clothing. They refused to return the dress when she needed to use the latrine. Biological necessity forced her compliance. The moment Cochon observed her in the male garments, the underlying reason for wearing them was legally ignored. He immediately invoked the ecclesiastical rule of the relapsed heretic. Under canon law, an individual who repented and subsequently repeated the religious offense was instantly handed over to the secular authorities for execution without any further trial. Exiting the prison, Cochon reportedly laughed and informed the Earl of Warwick that the objective was complete. At dawn on May 30, 1431, 2 monks informed Jeanne she was to be burned that day. The military commander suffered a psychological collapse, terrified of being reduced to ash. In a glaring theological contradiction, Cochon permitted her to receive communion. Under strict church law, an excommunicated heretic is forbidden from receiving the sacraments. This authorization implicitly admitted she remained in God's grace. When the bishop entered her cell, Jeanne delivered her final verdict. "Bishop, I die through you." Jeanne was transported to the Old Market Square wearing a sulfur-soaked gown engineered to accelerate combustion. She was escorted by 800 heavily armed English soldiers to prevent civilian intervention. At the execution site, the secular justice system collapsed entirely. The secular judge was legally required to formally pronounce the death sentence, but the English infantry, impatient and agitated, demanded immediate action. Bowing to the military mob, the judge entirely bypassed the sentencing phase, simply waving his hand and ordering her taken. Legally, it was an extrajudicial execution. Guards bound her to the wooden stake, turning her over to the state executioner to ignite the pyre. The architecture of the pyre was intentionally engineered for maximum cruelty. It was built on an unusually high plaster base. This prevented the executioner from employing the standard retentum, a hidden act of mercy where the victim was strangled from behind or pierced through the heart before the flames reached them. Jeanne was forced to experience the fire fully conscious. The executioner managed the combustion in distinct stages. A preliminary fire burned away her sulfur-soaked clothing. The executioner then deliberately pulled the flames back, forcing the massed crowd to view her naked, burned anatomy. This calculated political maneuver inflicted maximum public humiliation while physically dismantling the myth of the Holy Maid. It securely locked in her biological identity, proving to the French populace that she had not escaped and no substitute had been burned in her place. Following this display, the executioner piled on massive quantities of wood and pitch. The flames fully engulfed her. She died of carbon monoxide poisoning and severe thermal shock, her final scream being the single word, "Jesus." The English state remained terrified of her political gravity even after clinical death. They recognized that if the French resistance recovered even a single bone fragment, it would be weaponized as a holy relic to rally the army. When the second fire subsided, the relatively low heat of the wood fire had left her skeletal structure and heart intact. Lord Warwick ordered total obliteration. The executioner constructed a third fire, packing the organic remains in dense charcoal and pitch to create an intense furnace effect, raising the temperature above 800 degrees Celsius. After hours of continuous burning, her bones shattered into fine white dust. The group of soldiers threw the ashes directly into the swift currents of the Seine River to extinguish all symbols of the opposition faction. The English objective was to ensure she possessed no physical grave, disconnecting her anatomy from the earth to deny her physical resurrection on Judgment Day under medieval theology. The ashes drifting down the Seine were intended to permanently erase the Armagnac resistance. However, the psychological trauma of the execution immediately shattered the perpetrators. Geoffroy Thérage, the state executioner, suffered a mental breakdown, fleeing to a monastery crying that he was damned for burning a saint. The total obliteration of her anatomy triggered widespread psychological denial. A significant portion of the French populace categorically refused to accept her death. This created a strategic vacuum heavily exploited by opportunists, including impostors who infiltrated the highest echelons of society. The most prominent impostor sustained a massive psychological delusion for years, funded by veteran soldiers and municipal leaders. King Charles VII eventually demanded this impostor repeat the classified intelligence originally delivered at Seine. Confronted with this impossible test, the impostor confessed and was neutralized. It was not until 1450, after the French military finally recaptured Rouen, that Charles VII initiated proceedings to clear her name. He did this primarily to protect the theological legitimacy of his own crown. In 1456, a massive church tribunal interviewed 115 surviving witnesses. They formally annulled the 1431 verdict and declared the original trial a political fraud. Nearly 5 centuries later, in 1920, the same Catholic Church that had burned her officially elevated her to a saint. Jeanne d'Arc's operational life remains a testament to the geopolitical power of firm conviction. She was a terrified, brilliant, and unyielding teenager weaponized by kings, trapped by clerics, and ultimately abandoned by the exact state she saved. How could a nation that coldly surrendered its paramount military commander to the flames subsequently rely entirely on her ashes and legacy to legitimize its own sovereign existence?